Welcome to Talk 4 of the Dr. James Cousins Lecture Series on Southern Alberta history, recorded in 1974. Today he talks about early Lethbridge, but first, his warm-up.
I saw them. For instance, Haggard's yellow oil will prevent diphtheria. I'm sure you'll be glad to know that. They're not selling Haggard's yellow oil anymore, but it's pure. Mr. A.W.R. Markley, General Agent for Confederation Life Association, spent the last week in Lethbridge taking risks. sounds like insurance was a pretty shaky business. Here's another interesting one. Gabriel Dumont, who was the leader of the Métis Army in 1885. July the 31st, 1886, Gabriel Dumont is appearing with the Buffalo Bill Show in the United States. March the 22nd, 1889, Gabriel Dumont is collecting French half-breeds in Montana to take part in the Great Paris Exposition. This is our old pal, you see. That's what happened to him. And here is an advertisement that I'm sure you'll appreciate because it's in the tradition. It's called Mist on Earth. And so, as morning sun with strong and vivid ray drives from the east the sullen mists away, so BBB in strength and power grand doth rout disease and stay death's heavy hand. And BBB, of course, is Burdock's blood bitters, which you can still get, I think, can't you? Seems to me I've seen them not too long ago. Here is something from the Calgary Tribune. Charles Oddsocks died and went above. He was refused admission. He went below, but was denied admission there also. So he raised his eyes to heaven and said, "My God, do I have to go back to Medicine Hat?" I just thought you'd be interested in some of these silly little things that I kept noticing. I have another one here on Jerry Potts. I better not read that until later, in which Jerry Potts does his famous interpreting. And after one long speech, he says, tea. After another long speech, he says tobacco. And after the concluding oration, he says tea and tobacco. And the Governor General says, well, what about the rest? He says, all rot. This is the reason why I always say we don't give sufficient credit to the interpreter, because Chief Joseph didn't say, from where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. It was his interpreter who said that. What Chief Joseph said, we don't know. He might have said all rot, the way Jerry Potts translated it. Well, I can go on with a few of these. You see what I mean by warm-up. You see, I used to use this, some of my students know that, to get people in on time. I start 5 minutes early. Here's a weather forecast made by the oldest old-timer who had been here 50 years in 1888. And here it is. Unless we have an unusual amount of snow and cold weather, this will be a very mild winter. The editor said this prediction is as clear as mud. Well, I mean, it's quite true, isn't it? And here's another little poem, December 31st, 1885, about the third issue of the magazine. You'll recognize it as a parody on The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck. It's the Bronco Buster. The kid sat on the bronco's back, whence all but he had fled, into the air or took a seat upon the backyard shed. The horse bucked on, he would not go. Kid held the bucking strap, till after one terrific buck, the boys all heard it snap. Stay with him, they cried aloud, and do not take it so, for you can stick the buckiest horse that ever we saw go. Then came an awful thundering buck, the kid, oh, where was he? Ask of the winds that far around sweep over NWT. End. Where's the kid? He's probably still up there somewhere. And here's something, I thought the date must be wrong with it. It says the Belfast rioting is apparently going on interminably. The date, October the 6th, 1886. Is that when they started? And here's another, Gleason, July the 5th, 1886. Poundmaker died here on Sunday last. This was the Cree leader of the 1885 rebellion. And here's the census on the 5th anniversary, July the 2nd, 1890. 789 men, 281 women, 408 children, a total of 1,478 souls. They're very fond of souls in those days. There were 416 buildings in Lethbridge in 1890 when it was incorporated, 255 dwellings, 161 warehouses, stores, and offices. The foreigners included Hungarians, Swedes, Belgians, Germans, and French. There's the good guys, the white hats, and the bad guys, the black hats, you see. The Honourable Minister of Customs, Mackenzie Bowell, visited Lethbridge and wanted to go west through the Crow's Nest Pass. He asked the company for a map of the Kootenays, and the one they gave him was predominantly green in color. This is an in-joke because you should realize that Mackenzie Bowell, who later became Prime Minister of Canada, was the Grand Master of the Orange Lodge, and green was not their favorite color. That's the only reason why that joke was put in there. The first burial in the new cemetery was Frank Greer, who died of consumption at the age of 25. The first wedding in town was Mr. E.J. Hodder and Miss A.I. Forbes in the Presbyterian Church with the Reverend Mr. Robertson on the 12th of March, 1886. As the editor said, this is the first occasion of this kind in our town. Most of the other fellows went east and got themselves wives, or went back to the old country and got wives. The CPR obligingly put on excursions, and they went back to Ireland, Scotland, and England and picked up these little girls that were so eager to come out and share their prosperity. Now here's another one that puzzles me. I'm glad that the doctors are here to appreciate this. April the 10th, 1889. I remember the railway was finished in 1885. So 4 years is the maximum that the railway could have been going. Dr. Kevin, former dispatcher with the Northwest Coal and Navigation Company's railway, is visiting Lethbridge. He is now resident surgeon in St. Mary's Hospital in Brooklyn. That's what I call instant surgical practice. At the most, it was 4 years. Medical training must have been a lot less difficult than it is now. The streets are dry, the mud is gone, but the pesky housefly still hangs on. You've heard the expression, white man speak with forked tongue. The Indians called Lieutenant Governor Dewdney the man of 7 tongues. No forked tongue for him. Do you remember the names of the streets in Lethbridge? Because I'm going to be using them. Starting with First Avenue, that's by the station, right at the top end of Gulf Gardens, is Baroness Road. And then the next one to that, the one around the corner from the Lethbridge Hotel, is Ford Street, and that one keeps popping in all the time. Then there's Redpath Street. Now these are all the avenues. That's 3rd Avenue. And Dufferin Street, that's 4th Avenue, and Bumpus Street is 5th Avenue, and Cortlandt Street is 6th Avenue. They just broke up the sidewalk with Cortlandt Street on it when they made the road down to the river the other day. And 7th Avenue was London Street. It didn't get into the news very much. And on the other side, starting on 4th Street, it was McLeod Road, Galt Street, Wood Street, Smith Street, Brown Street, Crab Street, Glen Street, Burdett Street. You don't have to write them all down. Would you like to? Okay, I'll slow down a little bit. You got all the avenues? They're all called streets, except Barron's, it was a road. Well, First Avenue was called McLeod Road. And then the rest of them were all called streets. Galt Street was 2nd Street. 3rd Street was Wood Street. And 4th Street was Smith Street. And 5th Street was Round Street. And in these days, the center, the hub of the city, of course, was Redpath and Round. That was the corner where all the mud holes were. Then 6th Avenue was Crab Street, and 7th was Glynn. And 8th Street was Burdett Street. And 9th was Coots Street. Had to put the two together, you know, Coots, Burdett. And then 10th was Cutville Street. 11th was Ashmead Street. And 12th was Bartlett Street. And then we get down to Westminster Road, which was 13th. That was the limit. Well, so much for all these other little things. I was interested the other night in watching a television program in which they were exposing Redpath icing sugar. Did you see that? That's the same name as our street here. Redpath, apparently, even back in the 1880s, was a sugar importer in Montreal. And so he was known as a great financier, and so some of his money got into the operation. That's where his name comes from. Now, I have a little difficulty. I brought too many wrong things along with me today. I had a little sheet of paper that I intended to put in here of all the topics that I wanted to take in regard to Lethbridge, and I'm not going to be able to do them all, and I've been working at it. So the first one I've got is Lethbridge unincorporated, and a few pages on how the city got started, and I will not mention the streets again. I mentioned them at the beginning. And then the next little topic that I chose was community effort, how they got things done. The next one I have is the mounted police, the Simi side of the mounted police. I have an article on incorporation, and I have one on forage ferries and halfway houses. And then I was, if I do get this ready for publication, I will have things on the schools, on the churches, on the part played by women, the entertainment, so many things. I've got hundreds of pages of notes, you see. And the interesting thing was that Lethbridge was very active in drama right from the very beginning. From the time that mounted police officers had wives, there was drama. As a matter of fact, I think it was Inspector Neal that in I think it was the Lethbridge News, the announcement of Inspector Neal and his new wife's marriage was in the paper, and a little farther down was the announcement that Mrs. Neal was getting a play ready to present in Mclaugh and Lethbridge in the next few weeks. She wasn't wasting any time. Now, Lethbridge has been very fortunate to have two very good record keepers in the area in the form of our two newspapers, the Gazette, which started in 1882, and the Lethbridge News, which started in 1885. So the work that I do leans heavily on the news that is reported by both of these journals, but other sources have been culled to make the story a little more cogent. For example, Mr. A. Den Otter, an Alberta student who is now a professor at Memorial University in St. John, Newfoundland, is doing a doctoral thesis on the Gauls and their Western interest. And so he gave a paper at the Canadian Historical Association in 1973, which gives information on the Gauls and parliamentary debates and things that weren't known commonly before. So I have drawn on him and as many other sources, both local and national, as I can get, including going all the way down to Ottawa to look up C.A. McGrath's papers in the files of the National Archives. Today I ran into a question. I had a date there where they were going to have a vote in September the 19th, and then found that the election took place on July the 19th, and I didn't know whether I miscopied it or the newspaper miscopied or what happened. And then the next thing I knew that I had an announcement of the election, which took place on the 19th, given and dated the 18th by the returning officer. So either he made a mistake or I did. I'm not sure. Now, the amount of material I have is so vast that I've just picked out a couple, a Welsh couple. That's any number more than two, because the dullness factor might hit you a little bit too hard. Now, pre-Lethbridge, the community did not appear under the name of Lethbridge until 1885, and even then the name was not bestowed until the community had already appeared. This is because the Post Office Department thought that two Lethbridges were too many for Canada, and the surveyed town site was known as Colehurst Northwest Territories for a few months, until the Postal Department grudgingly permitted the name October the 4th, 1885. Coleman ran into the same trouble. There was a Coleman in Ontario, and the Postal Department dragged its feet too before they let them change the name. Previously, the area had so many names that it's almost impossible to keep track of them. Coal Banks, Sichochtochs, as my black students tell me, Black Rocks, and a variety of other descriptive Indian names, all much more colorful and less flat than the horrible flat sound of Lethbridge. It was easier for me, when I went touring for the Chamber of Commerce, to say I'm from Whoop-Up, the long vowels in that, Whoop-Up, but Lethbridge, you know, it's a couple of blop, blops. It's a very poor name. I'm glad they didn't name the river Lethbridge. Then we would have had two flat sounds. However, William Lethbridge had a commodity that rang a lovely sound in the ears of early promoters of this place, the coin of the realm. And so this place became Lethbridge. It was one of these financial conversions. It is well to remember, too, that business and banking panics took place in 1871 and 1891, each followed by a depression, without any improvement between 1871 and 1891. 3 or 4 times the Lethbridge News and the Mclaugh Gazette talk about these are rather dull times, but you know, every town has its dull times. Well, they had a series of dull times all the way through for about 6 years. This place began to boom after 1896, not before. So you can see that when Lethbridge does a little bit of booming, they're minor booms compared to the boom from 1905 to 1913, as Mr. McGrath says. So Lethbridge was born in a difficult period of low prices and business stagnation. So the difficulties in raising money for the Canadian Pacific were echoed in Alexander Tillott Galt's difficulties in Western land enterprises. In 1879, Elliot T. Galt brought back to his father, Sir Alexander Tillott Galt, coal samples he had picked up on a trip west. Like most optimists of his time, he envisaged a swarm of settlers descending upon the prairie with the development of the industry necessary to sustain them. And as the new CPR was going to go through the Yellowhead Pass on the old fur trade route, the Geological Survey had concentrated on the area where the railway was going to go and had discovered several fine coal deposits close to Edmonton. There seemed to be no hope for mining in this area so far from the railway, so no action was taken. But in 1881, the omnipotent railway builders suddenly changed their minds and decided that the railroad should run through the southern plains. Nobody knows what caused them to do it. I've even heard of a tentative survey of the Crow's Nest Pass and never been able to get the CPR to tell me what it was or where it was or how it was. Well then, of course, I think Sanford Fleming had something to do with changing their minds on that. And so, Galt then sent out a mining engineer named Captain Nicholas Bryant to examine the sites that Elliot Galt had reserved. Now, John A. MacDonald promised him the land at $2 an acre with a royalty of 15 cents a ton on the coal produced. Bryant reported favorably on the locations, as did Dr. George M. Dawson of the Geological Survey in 1881. Now, I thought I had it recorded, but it's not in this paper. It's in Boats and Barges on the Belly, where the editor gets a little mixed up, and he uses the word audits, and he means adits, which are tunnels. And he says that there were audits on the Big Bend, and there were audits at Blackfoot Crossing, and several audits, but everywhere except on the Big Bend, the coal was of inferior quality. On the Big Bend, it was good, but after a time, it went away to powder in a reasonably short time. But the Lethbridge coal, it was absolutely perfect, and so this was where we digged, said Mr. Stafford. Now, the editor used to go off into rhapsodies about the Lethbridge coal every once in a while. I guess he wanted to convince people, and including himself, that it was very good coal. And he would tell a story of someone who started from Calgary with 7 tons in a train, or 7 tons of Pennsylvania coal. Before he got to Medicine Hat, he had to reload, and finally made Medicine Hat. But at Medicine Hat, he loaded up with 7 tons of Galt coal from coal banks, and went all the way back to Calgary without stopping, and had some coal left over. Sounds like the fish and the bread a little bit, doesn't it? But this is the sort of stuff that he used to keep spreading, you see, about Galt coal, Lethbridge coal, wonderful coal, great stuff. Well, it was not all as easy as the report makes it. In spite of all his enterprises, Mr. Galt was short of money. However, he was appointed to the post of Canadian High Commissioner to Britain. And so while he was over there, he showed these reports of his coal to a wealthy publisher named William Lethbridge. His partner W.H. Smith and William Ashmead Burdett Coots put up 2,000 pounds each, and on April 1882 they incorporated the Northwestern Coal and Navigation Company with a capital, and I can't figure out this sum, 50,900 pounds. What the 900 was for, stamps, I suppose. But you notice the names? Smith Street, Ashmead Street, Burdett Street, Coote Street. You can see who started this. The first board consisted of William Lethbridge, who was president, and Smith and Galt and Burdett Cootes, W.M. Ramsey, W. Ford, Peter Redpath, and Edward Crabb. Only Ramsey didn't get a street named after him. Wonder if his ghost is still wandering out there on the plain. The company had great support from Prime Minister MacDonald, but of course it had opposition from Liberal Mr. Blake. He claimed the plans were monopolistic. You know, when you're in the opposition, you always have to claim plans are monopolistic, otherwise people aren't going to listen to them. So in 1882, Captain Bryant, his wife and daughter, and William Stafford of the Acadia Coal Company, and 3 other men made the 45-day trip by train and steamer to Fort Benton. And from there they took wagons and supplies to Blackfoot Crossing, the nearest of their claims to the CPR right-of-way. The coal was very poor, so they went to coal banks where the coal was of high enough quality to be useful. And at this point, Mr. Den Otter was using the narrative of Jean Stafford Kelly from the Lethbridge Herald of July the 11th, 1935. She had written that. I think her papers are available, and Mr. Pete has promised to let me look at them, and I shall certainly use them and give them credit for it. Now, Galt wished to form a colonization company. He had done this in Galt, Ontario, but he gave up the idea. However, he did visit the site and decided to go ahead with the mining because of the high quality of the coal. So a group of Nova Scotia coal miners dug 2 drifts and took out 22,000 tons of coal, which they sold mostly to Fort Mclaugh. Now, this mine was directly across the river from the mine operated by Nicholas Sharon, who had come into the country with Johnny Healy about 1869 or 70. On this very same year, Sharon was drowned in crossing the Old Man's River, and the very first issue of the Mclaugh Gazette carried an advertisement offering a reward for the recovery of his body, and it never was recovered. He had an awful lot of trouble. He would spell the name, the editor, this way sometime, way sometime, and the Sharons, I'm sure, must have, because other members of the family came up later, and their coming was noted in the newspaper, in the Dew column, and of course the family still persists here, but you'd like to see it spelled in any of these ways, and maybe a couple more I haven't thought of. The editor had a great deal of trouble in spelling certain words. This one was his favorite, and he couldn't decide between this word and this word, so he spelled it this way. That way, then he didn't bother anybody. See, the Chinese wouldn't get too put out about it, and the French, well, the sacré anglais, the maudit anglais, no, they wouldn't do this anyway. They couldn't pronounce French right. And it's interesting that his sister, Mrs. Joe McFarland, put the ad in the paper and the reward offered. And hers, of course, was recorded as the first marriage of 2 white people in the area. Now, that's a temporary diversion. This is the thing I do all the time. I wander off the topic, and I have to keep notes in front of me so I won't go way out there in left field. Now, so I'll return to Mr. Galt. And his problem of transporting coal seemed not too difficult because, after all, there was a river running from his mines to the railway. So Lethbridge and Medicine Hat became instant shipbuilding centers, while Fort Mclaugh became the barge building center of the Whoop-Up country. And because the company had timber limits up on the Castle River, and they used to cut the logs and float them down the river, and then they had a sawmill here afterwards, but they were cut in Mclaugh at first. That's where the barges were built there. And it is often overlooked that the Northwest Company owned these timber limits and were very strong in the sawmill business. Now, I won't go too much into the shipping industry history because Alec Johnson has done this in his Boats and Bellies on the Barges. I might as well say it wrong because I never say it right anyway. But we find that the ships, the Baroness and the Alberta and the Minnow and the 22 barges goes on with an interest undiminished in all the history of Lethbridge. There was one old gentleman who, a printer, Mr. Burr, who spent his time drawing pictures to scale of the Alberta and the Baroness and the Minnow, which was the little tiny one. There are pictures of them existing, and in the book on, let's see, I can't even remember the name of it now. It's the one on boats and so on in the Western Canada, where the Baroness and the Minnow end up in Edmonton and other places. Well, no, the Baroness doesn't. She ends up here in the sawmill, and then finally pumps water up out of the mine and hauls cars up from the bottom and so on. That's what happened. I have that someplace. Well, but the means of transportation was a colossal failure because only 200 tons were transported in the first summer of 1883. So Galt had anticipated that this might be so, and the girl who typed this for me said, you know, my husband and I go canoeing, and we appreciated his difficulty with his barges because every once in a while we have to get out and carry the canoe over the shoals, and that's right here at Lethbridge. So, but if you read this Bruce Peel's book on barges and so on, you will see that some of the weird devices they had. They even had things like grasshoppers' legs. They'd put them forward and it would pull the boat forward. You see, just like a grasshopper. And they'd have winches to drag them up over practically over the gravel when there was hardly any water in different rivers in Canada. So boats and barges wouldn't survive long anywhere, even on the North Saskatchewan River, because they had so much difficulty there. Now, Galt had already anticipated this difficulty and started negotiations with John A. Macdonald for help for a railway. The Prime Minister gave him a charter, but nothing else. So he gave up the idea for 1882. At least the Northwest Coal and Navigation Company supported him and increased capitalization from £50,900 to £100,900, stamps and stationery. And they incorporated the Alberta Railway and Coal Company with a capital of £1.5 million. The directors of the new company were Redpath, Galt, Ford, Cutbill, Staveley Hill of London, along with James G. Ross of Quebec. Notice the Staveley Hill was later in Leavings, Nanton, and he was the one who wrote the book From Home to Home. He became interested in ranching in this area, and Staveley, of course, is named after him. Now, while we're at it, I mentioned this map that I had copied. When this was done, this is a copy I had made by the National Archives, it's marked on their public archives, of the different places on the railway, and I want to read them to you. There was a place called Chin, but Chin was never a stopping place and it never had a station there. However, there was Woodpecker a little farther along, and it took its name from an island in the Old Man River, straight north of where Warren, or not, what's the name of the town? It's the one next to Tabor, on the other side of Tabor. Barnwell. And then a little farther along, you will see there was another tank at at Purple Springs. Nobody stopped there, and then there was one at Grassy Lake. And if you look at the map, I'll pass it around, straight north of Grassy Lake, you'll see the junction of the two rivers, at that time the Belly and the Bow, and you'll see that there's a little place called Bow Island, there is an island called Bow Island, just as there was a Woodpecker Island. But there is no Bow Island on the railway, so that the story that the two towns became mixed up on the map is all wrong, because Grassy Lake is here in 1890, Bow Island hadn't come into existence yet. And then the next one, of course, is Cherry Coulee. Very interesting name, because Cherry Coulee was the name of a coulee just a little to the north of it. And then there was, you leave Alberta at Cherry Coulee, and you go into Assiniboia, and then you have Winnifred and Seven Persons, and then Dunmore. So you can have a look at this, and you'll be interested in such names. I gave you the wrong name the other day. This place at Sterling, 15 Mile Butte and Rocky Lake, and the Mclaugh Benton Trail is marked on here, even although the railway from Lethbridge to Coots is shown on here, with the little town of Brunton, which now doesn't exist either. So I can just pass this around. You can have a look at it at your leisure. Now, the summer of 1884 was no success either, as the Baroness and the Alberta and the Minnow got down only 3,000 tons to the railway. The legislation made the railway possible, but the profit and loss sheet was very discouraging, and investors were beginning to get a little bit wary. So in dealing with the government, it was decided that they would build a cheaper line, a narrow gauge railway, and asked only to buy one half of the allotted land, that is, which was 3,840 acres at $1.50 an acre, plus the survey dues. This alone came to $500,000, but MacDonald agreed. So off to England went Galt again, this time taking with him Casimir S. Gzowski. You know Casimir Gzowski because he was on a stamp not too long ago, and his grandson Peter Zowski of the CBC was on This Country in the Morning. But he was one of these Polish expatriates who had, one of the aristocracy of Poland who had been kicked out when things got a little bad in there. And he became a great financier in Canada. And apparently, people in England had great faith in him. You know, they can trust foreigners before they can trust colonials, you see. And so the fact that Mr. Zowski was along was very important to them. Wait a minute, let's find where I got lost now. With Burdett Coutts and Mr. Smith, they finally convinced Lethbridge to increase his investment. And the government then granted 1,920 acres per mile of railway at a cost of 10 cents an acre. And Coalbanks was on its way. So Galt was given the contract, October the 17th, 1884, by the AR&C Company to build a narrow gauge line for $550,000. And even the CPR helped by transporting the equipment for 50,000 tons of coal. You know, eggs for butter, butter for cheese, and so on. The Fort Mclaugh Gazette notes that 12 miles of roadbed were completed by the middle of November before winter closed in. Then the CPR announced that they had found coal fields vaster than any yet known. This was a typical CPR gambit because it was false. This scared off the investors, and when the Northwest Rebellion broke out in 1885, they were afraid the railway construction would have to stop. However, under military protection, with things looking very gloomy, they managed to get the railway completed on August the 25th, 1885, and Governor General Lord Lansdowne made the official opening on September the 24th. So there is a railway, a narrow gauge railway, all the way from Dunmore. And Dunmore had ambitions to be a great town. It wasn't going to have anything to do with Medicine Hat. As a matter of fact, it fought like anything to keep out of Medicine Hat School District. Now, if you've ever been to Dunmore, you'll wonder what all the fuss was about. But they had a nice hotel there, and they had several stores, good quality meat. One fellow said you couldn't tell whether it was beef or mutton, but it was meat anyway. It was pretty hard when you can't tell the difference. But I was told that in Calgary at one time, one of the restaurants served the sheep raisers of southern Alberta with veal, thinking they wouldn't know the difference. He picked the wrong bunch. They were indignant about the whole deal. Well, so the new town was laid out with a village square facing the railway station and the streets named for the great and near-great financiers from afar. The temporary name Colehurst became Lethbridge on October the 4th, and Lethbridge News was born on December the 4th, 1885. And its files were kept complete, except for one or two issues, by the Manitoba Legislative Library, and God bless the librarian who saved them, or we wouldn't have anything in news at all. The new town was laid out with the village square then, but I think I'll take a slightly different tack now, because I'm going to deal with the unincorporated community by topics. So I'll start out with the town, and we'll see. Legend persists that Lethbridge streets were made wide so that I.G. Baker's bull teams along the Whoop-Up Trail could turn around. Charles A. McGrath, who laid out the town, said that story got started in 1885, first year of the town. But it wasn't true. After all, the Galts wanted everything centered around their railway, around their station. And that great square was certainly not going to be a place for bull teams to turn around. Certainly, the Galts didn't build railways for the propagation of ox teams, wouldn't imagine. And so the streets were named. And there wasn't a single bull with this name. And I gave you the names at the beginning so that you recognize them. And then starting with the issue of December the 31st, 1885, Mr. Saunders, T.E. Saunders, ran a series of articles on the history of Lethbridge. Now, one of the topics I'm going to do is on the newspaper itself. And when the paper started, Saunders and Wood, who had been at Mclaugh, came down and decided that Wood would run the Lethbridge News, and not Wood, Saunders would run the Lethbridge News, and Wood would stay in Mclaugh. And for a long time they didn't announce, they just had Lethbridge News Company. They didn't announce who the editor was, and the Gazette made a little fun of him. It said, he must be an Irishman, because only an Irishman would announce that a train load of empty cars loaded with goods arrived in Lethbridge the other day. And then a few weeks later they separated, and from that time on they became rivals, each boosting his town. Here's, I'm going to get a little rhetorical now, so you'll excuse me if I go off on the deep end, but this man is describing the place that he's going to learn to love. 5 months ago, oh, wait a minute. 5 months ago, the winds which swept down from the mountains passed silently over the site where they are now met in their onslaught by hundreds of buildings. 5 months ago, there was not a house in Lethbridge. Today, there are fine business houses doing an extensive and prosperous business, and a population of 1,200 people. 2 years later, when he's starting up his third year, he says, it was rather difficult getting started in a town of 200 people. Well, I mean, he's going to let anybody outside know that. It is almost more than one can realize, and seems as if it had been called into existence by the wave of a magician's hand. Not one, the hand. I had looked at twice. When the next maps are issued, a glance at one of them will show Lethbridge to be nearly 800 miles due west of Winnipeg, a little over 100 miles from Medicine Hat, some 28 miles from Fort Mclaugh, and some 60 miles north of the international boundary line on the 49th parallel. Almost under the shadow of the great Rocky Mountain range, 80 miles distant, the residents of Lethbridge can feast their eyes upon the gorgeousness of the towering peaks as the bright summer sun sinks, there's a beautiful alliteration there, to its rest in the bosom of the great Pacific. Its fading light trembling and glancing among the rugged rocks and canyons and tinting the rocky spires with pink and saffron and crimson and gold and yellow. To the north, sunk 200 feet below the level of the town and walled in by precipitous banks in which lies buried sufficient coal for many generations to come, winds the historic and euphoniously named Belly River. You know, I ran into something yesterday. I was reading a book on Baudelarization. You know, they Baudelarized this. Dr. Baudelaire changed things so that young ladies could read. I don't know what made the young ladies so important. Read it without blushing. And in the Bible, when they did a little Baudelarizing on the Bible, there were two words that bothered them. One was grunt and the other was belly. That's rather interesting. He calls it euphonious. But remember I told you the other day that very same year, 1886, people of Lethbridge were complaining that that was not really the kind of river that should flow through such an up-and-coming metropolis. Well, the euphoniously named Belly River then, now listen to this, bearing its ice-cold waters from eternal glaciers in lofty nooks of the mountains towards the land of the rising sun. It goes without saying that such water is delicious. It is absolutely pure and clear as crystal, passing Lethbridge just as it left its icy source. No contaminating sewers empty their garbage into its clear stream. You want to shout liar, do you? And one cannot help pitying those who drink the stagnant water of the eastern and northern prairies, while we are enjoying a perfect surfeit of the same element in its purest possible state. Well, I couldn't go on like that forever, but he does. He really laid it on, boy. This is some town. Well, this is a rather prophetic utterance for Green Acres. Lethbridge is situated as nearly as possible in the center of what may be termed the garden of the Northwest. Sounds like Jimmy Durante. Every city he came to, the garden spot of America. Well, this is the garden spot of America. Bentley and Company opened their first store in a tent in June. At that time, only a solitary building stood on the site. Great building progress was hampered only by lack of material. The editor thinks there's one thing, and that is out on the plains there's a shortage of water. But he thought a few strategically located artesian wells would solve the water problem on the plain. That's a bit of a joke because you can't get artesian wells unless you've got the proper formation, and most of the area around here hasn't got it. And one of the little topics that I worked up for, one of the talks I gave to some ladies in the kindergarten school once, was on wells in Lethbridge. it's the biggest story of failures you've ever heard in your life. They finally get a well down at the Lethbridge house, 150 feet, and the editor even gives up and says, well, we wish you success. And that's the last he mentions of Mr. Henderson's well. Well, we have other descriptions of the area. For instance, somebody made a trip across Canada from St. John, New Brunswick in 1887, describing the summer of 1886. So the article was 1887. We come to Grassy Lake, about 4 miles long and much favored for fishing. Actually, it was much favored for hunting. That's where the Lethbridge guys used to go. It was the halfway spot on the railway. People used to stop there, and so you'd get an excursion. You'd go to Grassy Lake, and you could stay at the section house, and you could hunt around at Grassy Lake, and then you could come back on the train the same night, or depending on how they were running. They varied a lot in their running. But this man said, there is not a tree in sight, nor are there more than a dozen houses between Dunmore and Lethbridge. Lethbridge was bigger than the writer expected, with a nice grassy square with a bandstand where the police band plays. The bank is on one side of the square, while I.G. Baker, Bentley, Kavanagh, and Botterill stores are on the other. The bank was first made over on the side of Galt Gardens where Safeway is now, and that was a wooden building. Then they decided to put in a good building, and it was brick and two-story, and it's on that corner of Round and and Redpath Street, where the Treasury branch used to be, and remember that nice brick building, and that's the old bank, Union Bank building. It was built and then it was improved again afterwards, right on that corner. There are 3 hotels, the Lethbridge House, the Royal House, and the Russell House, and there is also a land office and 2 breweries. You'd be glad to know that. That's another article I have to deal with, is liquor. Because they used to have a hop beer that they made here, which was considered to be non-alcoholic. And the government decided to stop them making that. And the reason why appears in the editorial, the editor said, while it may be true that some unscrupulous people are putting alcohol into their product, you cannot condemn all of the brewers for the behavior of a few, implying that in Lethbridge they didn't do that. Well, actually, in another source, I read that they tested the beer and it had very little alcohol in it, and the Indians drank it and got roaring drunk. So either the Indians get drunk on the idea, or somebody must have put something in between the brewery and the Indians. I'm not quite sure. Now, from the town, you cross a small plateau to reach the bankhead of the mines, where the cars of the pit are landed, and opposite which stands the police barracks. The police barracks here in 1886 was the old boarding house that the company had. It was called, it had a mansard roof. Now, a mansard roof to us is just a barn roof. You see a lot of houses still with mansard roofs. It made a bigger attic. Well, this old boarding house, the company stopped using it, and they turned it over to the police, and the police nearly froze in it that winter, and they decided in the following summer to build the barracks, which was on the spot where the mounted police are now. A short distance further on, you come to the crest. Now, I want you to notice how these people look at the banks of the river. This fellow said, a short distance further on, you come to the crest of a line of hills which range themselves along the banks of the Belly River, which courses through this part of the country. On the banks, or bottoms as they are termed, are a number of ranches, as it is convenient to the raising of cattle. In April of 1887, a reporter named Cook, writing for the Times of London, traveled west, and he recorded what he saw in 1886. His view was different. He noted the buffalo trails up and down the bluffs of the Belly River. Notice the first one had seen a range of hills on the side of the river. He sees bluffs. It's almost as if one fellow is over here and looking at the hills. He's down there looking up at the bluffs. The people in Lethbridge looked at points, and today we look at coulees. We have a different geographic view of that same scene. Then this man noted the buffalo trails up and down the bluffs of the Belly River, but he noted there were no buffalo. At that time, he said there were 1,000 people about, of which 400 are employees in the mine, sawmill, and railway. Now here's typical times. The colliers get 10 shillings to 12 shillings a day, which in those days was from $2.50 to $3.50. And laborers get $1.50 to $2. The mines used coal-cutting machinery with an output of 150 tons daily in summer and 400 tons daily in winter. The coal is hauled up an incline 2,250 feet long and 250 feet high, and the coal sells at $4 a ton to the CPR at Dunmore. Sounds like he's writing for the investors in London to know just what things are like out there. It's an entirely different point of view from the other one. He also visited Mclaugh, which he said had a population of 500. He added that the wind blew stiffly against us, but was warm and balmy. The wind has blown away all the soil, leaving pebbles, so that the streets are very rough highways. If you've ever driven through Mclaugh off the highway, you know what that means. It hasn't changed any since 1886. I hope there's nobody from Mclaugh here who won't tell my friends up there. I'll never be able to face them. Well, this is a statement he made that is not true. He said it is mostly an American town with American money in circulation. Now, most of the people in Mclaugh and Lethbridge were not Americans at that time. You wait till about 1905 and 1910 and you'll see a lot of Americans, but not up until 1905. They're all Irishmen and Scotchmen and Nova Scotians and Englishmen and Ontarians and Quebecers and all the rest of it, because they were former Mounties, a lot of them. Now, another man, Professor Dawson, whom they called the Empire Special Commissioner, gives this information in 1889. Lethbridge now has a little over 1,200 people and is still growing. It is a nice town with good buildings, but mostly the coal mines dominate. 500 tons of coal a day are shipped out in 10 to 15 cars of 10 tons each. Now, when I worked at the Tipple, box cars with 5 numbers on them held 30 tons, and box cars with 6 numbers held 40 tons, and the open coal gondolas used to hold 60 tons. This is my past coming, and of course that was 1921, as differentiated from 1889. They are now using a vertical shaft with cages which replaced the lateral shaft. As the years went on, the company, and this is a part of the one that I haven't done yet on the mines, they built their first shaft just north of the railway, number 1, and then they put a ventilation shaft alongside of it, then number 2, and then number 3, and then number 4, all together, about 1891, the whole whack of them went in, shafts going down to get at the coal because they anticipated a great demand for coal when the railway was finished into the United States. The Great Falls Tribune, when the railway was coming in here in 1890, doesn't say anything new, but it says all the stores are neatly painted, which must be refreshing because every picture I've ever seen of any town in those days were ramshackle and unpainted. You ever see pictures of early Mclaugh, for instance? You think the buildings are going to fall over. Pictures of Higginbottom's drugstore in Mclaugh and so on. Now, so much for the descriptions of the town. The next topic is community effort. How did they get along? Well, lacking any form of local government, all progress depended on the initiative of the citizens, and it is noteworthy here that only the business and professional people, in conjunction with the numerous company officials, took any part in the community development. Usually, the editor of the News or the Gazette would throw out a suggestion, and the following week a notice would appear calling for a meeting in somebody's office or hall. Hall was a euphemism for any room where they usually served meals. They had no hall in Lethbridge until after incorporation, when they built that, what's that building where they tore down for the Safeway? The AR&I building, the one that had Mr. McGrath's face on it. At least that's what he claimed. He said when they opened that building, this is after 1891, the master mason wouldn't let him see that they kept a cover on it. When they unveiled it, there was a picture of a face. Remember seeing that face on there? Above the door, above the main door? Well, they claimed that was C.A. McGrath's visage that was staring down at people from there. You see how I can get pulled off on things? But they had no halls, and so they used to meet in everybody's office, usually in the news office or the lawyer's offices. There were a couple of them by this time. As an example, on May the 14th, 1886, the first concert was held in the square by the H Troop Band, and it was reported that they would play every Wednesday evening. So in an editorial, Mr. Saunders thought, well, there should be a bandstand because the band was quite a good band. So the committee that put on the celebration on the 24th of May had a $30 surplus. And they proposed to build a bandstand if they could raise another $45 by subscription. By June the 18th, the bandstand was ready for the next concert, and so the bandstand in the square was Lethbridge's first public work. There it was, by subscription. Another time, in July the 3rd, 1886, a meeting was called to set up a school district, which I'll deal with in detail some other time. Next time I give you a course. Now, the meeting concluded its business, and then they set up a committee while they were there discussing opening a school to pick a burying site. And this they did, and the cemetery was laid out north of the tracks by December 1886. It said it was 1 mile from town on a point north of the track. You know where that old graveyard is? Just on the other side of, what's that outfit? The Morrow, or the Caterpillar people? Yeah, it's right in there, right in behind there, and people are wondering what are we going to do with it. The trouble was, you see, that when Lethbridge expanded in 1891, most of the company, you'll see why if I ever get around to incorporation, why the company put all its buildings north of the track. Well, the reason was, of course, that their buildings were exempted. And anyway, the track was the boundary of the town, so that anything north, even if they were tempted to change their mind, they couldn't tax company property because it wasn't on city land. And that's why they had to decide to get another graveyard later. And then, when the cemetery was laid out, the editor suggested that maybe they should get subscriptions to fence the square. And the square it was in those days, always the square. Even before the school district was organized, a community attempt was made to set up a school. On February the 12th, 1886, the editor commented on the calling of a committee to open a school. He thought this would be a good idea as the children were running wild. This is the real value of schools. When I taught at LCI, I figured out once what it was costing the people of Lethbridge to educate their children, and I figured that for 25 cents an hour they were getting baby service, sitting service, even if they weren't taught anything, which was a pretty cheap babysitting, even in the days when I taught back there. So, with John Craig in the chair, C.P. Conybeare as secretary, and Messrs. Botterill, Stafford, and Mackay as trustees, they organized on a local basis. This is before they had their regular school district. They canvassed and got promises of payments of $29.50 a month. That should be enough to pay a teacher today. The Reverend Mr. Robinson offered the use of the new Presbyterian church to start, and it was announced that school would open on Monday next, and the Reverend Alfred Andrews would be the teacher until a school district was formed. Anybody over 6 was eligible to attend, and it was hoped that the parents would help defray the expenses. The children should bring their books and slates with them. Funny little things like that suddenly throw you back. It was a nice try, but the following week this note appeared. The school that was to have been opened here Monday morning was put off until further notice. They found out about the organization of a school district under the Board of Education at Regina in the Northwest Territories, and decided to organize properly, and that's why our first little school just didn't come to anything, but they tried it even on their own hook. Another public enterprise that got off the rails was the first hospital. Following the death of the miner, the need for some hospital care was realized, and the news noted that the company promised to give the land and 10,000 feet of lumber if the citizens would build a hospital. So, let some of our leading merchants take up the matter, says the news. Public meeting was called August the 25th, 1886. Mr. Stafford spoke strongly in favor, as a miner named Harrison might have been saved with such a convenience in town. So Messrs. Bentley, Craig, Mewburn, Bailey were on the committee to raise the money. By November the 10th, the lumber was hauled onto the site on the point south of the terrace where the old camp of sea troops stood last fall. It's not on the spot where Galt Hospital is today. By November the 17th, the building is being rushed and should be ready by mid-December. I want you to notice the size of it. It was 24 by 42 feet with an L of 12 by 16 feet. That's about 1,200 square feet, which is smaller than the house I'm living in, and must be smaller than some you're living in, with no basement. But what does the editor say about this wonderful big building? This will be one of the neatest and most substantial buildings in town. So you can judge the size of the homes in Lethbridge by the size of the hospital. And then there was silence from November the 17th, 1886, until September the 1st, 1887. I don't know what happened. Something must have happened. Then the news. The Northwest Coal and Navigation Company's hospital which has been at a standstill for the last 9 months, is to be completed immediately. It is being plastered and will be ready in 3 weeks. In other words, the company decided to build it themselves. Something went wrong with the financial arrangements, and so the community hospital got off the track. Shortly afterwards, it was announced that the company was operating it and that the police were putting their sick in there until they could build themselves a hospital at the barracks. So the editor raised the idea of a general hospital. There should be a general hospital in Lethbridge, or at least a nurse. Then you can use your own equation. One hospital equals one nurse, so you can't beat that. Because there were so many bachelors in town. The old term, we still use the bachelor, was the standard commodity in this part of the world. But that's how things remained until 1890, when, as part of the expansion resulting from the completion of the Lethbridge to Great Falls Railway in 1891, the original Galt Hospital was built by the company for the people. And I'm sure you've seen the picture in this book. It was a typical gingerbread building, and it cost about $10,000. That's what they allowed to make it. None of our hospitals has exceeded that figure since. Here is the picture of it, gingerbread and all. And if you like, I'll just pass this around. You can have a look at it. Well, in spite of many tries, Lethbridge didn't get an assembly hall until the magic year of 1891. They tried. But apparently, people in Lethbridge were awfully suspicious of people who were trying to sell shares in something. Lethbridge seemed to have a fear of joint stock companies. Mclaugh had built a hall by forming a joint stock company, and although, according to the Mclaugh Gazette, they feared that the winds would knock it down, it did serve as a hall anyway, but that's more than Lethbridge had. The buildings of the large police barracks, which were completed in 1886, did satisfy the need for most concerts and entertainments, especially when officers and their wives became interested in music and drama. The square came off a little better. The square, which had been called Grassy by a visitor, was the focus of the city. I've always put grassy in quotation marks because if you can imagine a grassy field in Lethbridge, I remember some of the fields out where I live that were full of cactus when I first came here. Not very grassy. There was grass there, but it was a little bit on the scant side. Of course, maybe it was wetter back then. That's another article, weather. You can see how many topics I've got. I'll have a million of them. If I live long enough to write the history of 5 years of Lethbridge, it's going to be a compendium that people are going to be afraid to read. Well, the buildings around the square were really the town, and everything was described as east or west or south of the square, while Baroness Road on the north paralleled the railroad, and it was nearly always called Baroness Street. It was Baroness Road, but Baroness Street is what they got on it. And because Lethbridge had no graded roads, it was frequently easier to cut across the square than to drive through the streets. As this square was the place where the favorite games of cricket and baseball, 2 words, were played, a rutted pitch was not very popular. For example, to show off Lethbridge's weather, it was announced on March the 12th, 1886, that, this is March, remember, that cricket was played in the square this week. Normal thing. It would have been golf today, but nobody was golfing in those days. The first band concert was there in that same month, and as a result came their bandstand. By March 1887, the editor was complaining about teams crossing the square and appealed to Inspector Steele to stop the police teams taking a shortcut across the square with water from the railway tank. Everybody was on water wagons here in Lethbridge. We had no waterworks, you see. 3 water wagons by 1891, 1 water wagon in 1885. You see, progress, all the way from 1 to 3 water wagons. And Mr. Brown owned 2 of them, and I forget who the other fellow was. All right, the Mounts Police decided to go around the square. But the square doesn't receive much other than casual mention until August 22nd, 1888, when in describing the sad state of the streets after the recent heavy rains, the editor suggested that the square be fenced to preserve it for public recreation. He has given up appealing to wagoners. He states that the company will supply the posts if the citizens will collect enough for a chain. And he suggests that a committee of Higginbottom, Craig, Kavanagh, Darch, Curry, McGrath, and MacArthur set up by a public meeting will decide how which were set up by a public meeting to decide how to spend a Northwest Council grant. There was a grant of $391 coming to Lethbridge from the Northwest Council, and they had to form a committee to know how to spend it. And he suggested that they might use it, for fencing the square, but instead they decided to use it for walks. Now the walks were generally either made of coal slack or gravel. They never really did have decent walks in Lethbridge when it was incorporated. And he lost out on that. The next year, in 1889, the editor noted that a subscription drive last year had failed. So maybe we should try again to get a subscription up to fence the square. On May the 1st at a public meeting, Lafferty, Conybeare, McCall, Henderson, Curry, Hawley, and Darch are appointed as a committee. One of my topics is the people of Lethbridge. All these funny names. They're merchants, they're officials of the company, they're lawyers. I could tell you almost each one of them now. I got to know them so well reading through them week after week, that I know which one is a company man and which one isn't. So, on May the 1st, at a public meeting, Lafferty, Conybeare, McCall, Henderson, Curry, Hawley, and Darch were appointed as a committee with power to call tenders to fence the square. And when the tenders were opened, Mr. Burrell had the lowest bid. The posts are painted brown below the chain and black above. The editor thought white would be better than brown. So if you have a picture of the square and it's fenced, you know that it must be after June the 5th, 1889. And if the posts are black looking, that means they were brown and black, then it was before, the next thing that I'm going to give you just a little bit later, July the 3rd. The editor thought white would be better than brown. By July the 3rd, 1889, the editor was complaining about a catcher's fence that was planted in the middle of a square. He said we should try to make this hideous eyesore a little more presentable. They'd stuck up a backstop for the baseball team. Must have been a masterpiece of monstrosities because the editor didn't like it. So Mr. Mclaugh then ordered the chain fence fixed up and promised to prosecute owners of trespassing horses and cattle. On October the 8th, 1890, the news reported that the chain was tightened and the cattle excluded, and the posts were painted white with red caps. Now that's October 1890. If you have pictures and you want, and the square is fenced, if they're white, it's after 1890. If they're black, it's before. And the posts were white with red caps. The grass was green after the recent heavy rains. This was when the railroad was built with the 3.5 inches of rain that I told you about. The square was all raked and ready for the great celebration. When the Great Falls Lethbridge Railroad opened, after being delayed by the aforesaid 3.5 inches of rain, which Lethbridge doesn't get that often. As a matter of fact, Mr. Mclaugh started to take weather almost as soon as the town was formed. And they tell me out at the weather station here that they have his records right back to 1886. The first news was, all the equipment has arrived for Mr. Mclaugh, except that the 2 thermometers are broken, so we'll have to wait till he gets new ones. A couple of weeks later, the new thermometers have arrived, and quite religiously he gives you the weather for about 6 weeks, and then he forgets all about it, and it comes in fits and starts after that, depending on whether he had room or not. But never once did he mention how much rain there was. He never gave precipitation figures. And according to him, the temperature in the first month they tested it was 104. In other words, higher than the all-time record. But maybe the thermometers hadn't been adjusted to the altitude or something. Now, let's have a look at another one, the Hook and Ladder Brigade. This is probably the least effective of all efforts, the firefighting organization. In February of 1887, the fire destroyed 8 company cottages at a loss of $6,400, $800 each. The editor had previously just suggested some sort of ordinance from the Northwest Council to be supported by tax money for fire protection, much like the Board of Education. Now he suggested that there be a Hook and Ladder Brigade to help fight fires. The police had turned out with their little carts, but had little effect on the fire, so the merchants complied, and all the main merchants formed a committee, and they raised $185, but were aiming at $250. And Bentley and Craig and Higginbottom and Curry and Kavanagh and McGrath went around and canvassed. There couldn't have been anybody else, but the same old bunch of guys went around. By April the 13th, the editor was asking, what happened to the Hook and Ladder Company? Are they waiting for another fire? Stir yourself, Chief, and do something. April the 27th, the company met. They have $100 and propose to spend $84 for tarpaulins. On July the 20th, the company is still comatose. The editor tried to awaken them by saying that a fire in Lethbridge House or the post office could put the whole business section out of action, assuming normal winds for Lethbridge. In September, the chief announced that he had collected $45 but needed another $75. He didn't say who the chief was. He took over the ladders which had been ordered from H. Stanbury and Company. A week later, it was announced that the ladders, etc., would be stored in Bentley's old ice house just east of John Craig's furniture warehouses. And that was that until March the 26th in 1890, when a fire in Regina reminded the editor that Lethbridge had only water carts in case of fire. He thinks mournfully of the Hook and Ladder Brigade and suggests, maybe we need a tank like those behind the company cottages. He gave up on the Hook and Ladder people. They just died. He thought perhaps Mr. Haltane could get some of the Mclaugh constituency grant to get the Hook and Ladder going again, but Mr. Haltane wasn't having anything. He was the MLA for this district. So nothing further happened, and Lethbridge went into incorporation with 3 water wagons and 2 railway tanks on company property, all ready to fight any fire that fortunately didn't come along. Now that was the topic. This is what I mean by the topic. Now that was the topic of community effort. Now, I don't know which one to give you next. Getting tired? Still surviving? I think the one I'll give you next is Fords, Ferries, and Halfway Houses. Did you like that? Maybe. As you read, you know, you find yourself noticing that you're here. And you're paying attention to the river, to the roads, to the crossings, to the bridges, and so on. And after I get through with the Fords, Ferries, and Halfway Houses, then I go on to one which is called Bridge on the River Leth. And that bridge, the history of this town is tied up in bridges. And as you know, we've got a new one coming up, and I hope that the inauguration of this new bridge will be a great more ceremonious than the inauguration of the first bridge. Do anybody remember here where that first bridge was? It was a bridge made with timber with rocks inside. Do you know where it was?
It's north of the present bridge. There's the abutment of the second bridge.
Yeah.
It's just south of that.
Oh, yeah.
And you could, I think.
Yeah, it was supposed to be across somewhere close to Sharon's mine.
No, it would be closer to the second bridge. It was to be after the 19th lot.
Oh, yes.
There is the pilings there with the rocks, you know, it used to be. I think.
Yeah, well, that's the one bridge that I'm talking about. It's the same as the wonderful school that was described here. The one that, according to that book, was torn down in 1920. Oh, you should read the description of that school. Why, it's far better than any parliament building or any cathedral that you've ever seen. The great sweeping entrance with the, I think there were 6 rooms in it, and Gothic windows, and Lethbridge stone, and oh boy, that was a wonderful school, that. And they tore it down in 1920. Some of the people here attended, I'm quite sure, if you remember 1920. I was going to school in 1920, and I'm just a young guy, so I'm sure a lot of you people. Well, travel in and out of the communities was much heavier than one might expect. The reports of hotel registrations and other local items showed a great deal of moving around in a variety of rigs and conveyances, but rarely does one run into any mention of road construction. So we must assume that the tracks across the prairies with the various forks and detours around mud holes, as many of us can remember, were the roads. And stagecoaches were used early, from Edison Hat until the railway was built, to Fort Mclaugh and Calgary until the railways cut them out. In 1891, Mclaugh to Calgary, in 1898, Lethbridge to Mclaugh. The Lethbridge News describes its stage as a Concord coach with 4 horses, and for years it was driven by Frank Follinger, who had a great reputation as a driver. For instance, an item on the first issue of December the 4th, 1885 stated, "The Mclaugh coach failed to connect yesterday. What's wrong, Polly?" Blaming the coach driver. The interesting thing is that D.W. Davis, who represented he was our first MP, he represented the I.G. Baker Company, which had stores both in Lethbridge and Mclaugh, seemed to be here almost every week. His name was in the paper just about every week. The poor guy must have spent more time traveling on that darn stagecoach up and down from here to Mclaugh. On several occasions in snowy winters, the coach turned up on runners instead of wheels, something I've never seen in any Western movie I've ever viewed, and I've seen them since 1914. Never once did the Chinook catch the stage with its runners down, but on several occasions there are reports of people coming across the Blood Reserve with runners on their rigs and were marooned in town because they couldn't get back or the sledding was too tough. The real difficulty was to get in and out of Lethbridge with no road construction because of the difficulty in getting up or down the banks and even more difficulty in crossing the river. The following in the first issue of the News. Inspector Drainer was in town, but the wagon had to be let down a good part of the hill by hand as Lethbridge approaches to the river. Now that's in the very first year. In describing the Stuart line of coaches, the editor mentioned Pollinger and says, "He drives his Concord coach up and down a terrible hill to the river. It is so bad now that even he won't try it." Even when they had negotiated the hills, the crossing of the river was often a formidable task. There were no bridges in the country, necessitating fording of streams when that was possible. In the same article mentioned, the editor states that the upper crossing at Kip is very icy, but the lower crossing at D. Fraser's house is only fair. The ford below Sharon's mine is excellent, but the hill is terrible. The regular hill road is better, but the ford is not useful because of the ice jam. Damned if you were and damned if you won't. You see, if you could get down the hill, you couldn't cross the river. If you could cross the river, you couldn't get down the hill. Well, and this is the thing that keeps impressing on you as you read the newspapers all the time. When the heck don't they put a bridge in? But it took a long, long time. Nicholas Sharon's drowning is reported, and several policemen were drowned in various river crossing attempts. More often it was stock or equipment that was lost. Mr. James Schofield of Pincher Creek lost a horse while crossing opposite the slaughterhouse last week. As a matter of fact, without fords or ferries, the editor would have been hard put for news. We have accounts such as these. October the 26th, 1887. The river is low, but the ice makes fording difficult. March the 22nd, 1888. The rivers are bad. The Mclaugh mail is delayed. April the 26th. The river at Kip is high and freight is piling up. A week later, the ford is now passable at Kip. May the 23rd. The river is down and safe for crossing. May the 26th, 1890. March the 26th. The upper ford is now crossable, but cannot be depended upon because the ice may go out at any time. In September 1890, after 3½ inches of rain, the mud was so bad that all traffic was suspended except in the downtown section. And the ford became impassable even in the month of September that year. That was the year of the great rain. Remember, 1890, when the railway came in here and when the town became incorporated. Actually, the incorporation took place in 1890, but the official opening was in February of 1891. Now, there was another way of getting across rivers, and that was by ferry, which, as you know, skitters across streams by means of a cable. Now, just as boats and barges failed, except at a medium water level, ferries failed just as lamentably. The Northwest Coal Navigation had a ferry quite early, and the News commented in 1886, "The ferry is being repaired in time for high water. George Harding is in charge." On May the 28th, the same year, it was reported that the ferry had broken loose when the cable broke and went down to a place opposite the mines. It took Steele Morris and T. McCockerty 3 days to get it back up. "It will be running by this evening," said Mr. Harding. But in another place in the same issue, it was noted that the ferry had broken loose again, but would soon be running. Poor old ferry. That ferry had more trouble than anything that I read about. It was obviously a ferry at Fort Kip. There was obviously a ferry at Fort Kip because D Troop tried to cross there in June 1887, and the boat tipped and 2 of their 4 horses drowned. The ferry floated all the way down to Lethbridge, where it grounded near the slaughterhouse. "This will cost the government a lot, so maybe they'll consider some bridges," said the News. The Lethbridge ferry was laid up for repairs as the water was too high anyway, and a little later it was back in service but broke loose again. and was snubbed down by the sawmill. So the ferries were highly successful. Mclaugh got into the act also. It says a ferry was put in at Mclaugh for the first time this year on Wednesday last. That was June 1887. It made only a few trips and was carried away by the strong current and went down the river quite a distance. Now I'm not making this up. This is just how it was recorded laconically every week by the editor. And I'd write it down and put ferries or bridges or something in front of it to find it. Now from this you would gather that ferries were no profitable proposition. In fact, in January the 26th, 1888, the company advertised the sale of ferry rights by auction on the Old Man's and Belly Rivers. On March the 29th, 1888, Mr. D.J. Campbell, auctioneer, came down, but there was nobody there to bid. Nobody wanted the ferry. By April, the river at Lethbridge was high, but no ferry ran. So people had to go by stage to the St. Mary's River. They were rowed across that stream and taken by coach to Mclaugh. The following year, the ferry was readied in March, but the water was so low that the ferry hadn't even run by April the 3rd, but finally got started on April the 17th, although the water was a little bit low yet. By this time, Mr. O. Burge was the owner and operator, and by June, the river was high and the ferry was working. In 1890, Mr. Burge had the ferry running on April the 30th, but this was the end, for the bridge was now approaching completion. But before going on with the bridge, there are a few other transportation aspects I should like to discuss. First of all, the Benton stage was still running and would keep running until the railway was built. And the bull teams continued their merry way all through, especially with heavy loads of hay and coal from Mclaugh. Now here's a description from the news of 1887. A bull train. Some queer names and queer transports are used in the world, and among them is the method of carrying coal from the mines of Lethbridge, Alberta, to Mclaugh, 30 miles distant in the same territory of Canada. A team is made up of, say, 3 enormous wagons, each weighing from 2,000 to 2,500 pounds and holding as high as 1,200 pounds of coal. To each are attached from 18 to 20 large oxen. The train consists of, say, he keeps saying say all the time, 6 of these teams or 18 wagons in all, or over 100 oxen. Figure that out. Each team has one driver with a very long and heavy whip, which he uses with great skill and appropriate language. The whole are under a wagon boss with a cook and a night herder, and these make up the outfit, as the common Western term goes. These teams travel about 12 miles a day and have carried 65 tons of hay into Mclaugh at one time, although the usual load is from 45 to 50 tons of coal. The night herder drives the oxen to pasture, watches them, and returns them for the day's work, as the animals get nothing but grass. One of these trains is a sight worth noting, and a simple Eastern visitor standing at the coal chute where 1 or 2 of these teams are trying to knot themselves will think that there are simpler things than undoing them. But lo, a twist or 2 of that whip, a sonorous command from Jeff Davis, the boss, and one worms away to the right and the other recoils upon itself, and you laugh. It looks so simple. But reader, if you want to cure a bad cold by starting a free sweat on a cold day, try to drive even 1 yoke of oxen on your first attempt. There was the article on bull train. Well, now the question of accommodation for travelers. Hotels of good quality were available in the settlements. The Mclaugh Hotel with Harry Camus Taylor prop. The Lethbridge House west of the square, W. Henderson proprietor, always advertised that way, west of the square. That's the Lethbridge Hotel. The Russell House is the one around the corner. What's it, the Arlington or Westerner? What do they call it now? But anyway, that was Russell House. At this time, you know, hotels are always going broke, and they were always changing the name, and they were renovated and brand new opening. You know, this was happening. One of the funniest ones was one of the hotels, I'm not sure which one it was now, had been damaged, and it was all refurbished, and had a wonderful new front on it with a big glass window, and there was a restaurant in there. And just as people were having supper, one of Lethbridge's famous winds blew and blew the whole front out of the building, and the people were dining al fresco. We're not very happy about it. Next thing you know, the owner has the hotel up for sale. Well, this is going to be under weather. I'm just sneaking all these things in here. I won't keep you too long, but I want to get that bridge built tonight, and I'll have to maybe. Would you like to hear more about Lethbridge next week if I continue? Sure. Okay, I'll go ahead then. I don't want to bore you, you know. I've been teaching so long I can tell when people start to get sleepy. I was thinking for the fan going, you know, get you all awake. Well, we got the voting going anyway. There was a good hotel in Dunmore which had visions of a rosy future, and in between were the famous halfway houses. Even on the railway there was one. The timetable showed that there was what we would now call a rest stop at Grassy Lake. Mr. Dawson described stopping there and having a good meal served by the buxom wife of the section foreman. All women were buxom in those days. Good word. No more buxom women. Everybody diets today. Well, this is what he says about it, though. He said that one of the fellows who had run that halfway house made so much money that he is now one of Lethbridge's chief hotel owners. So it must have been a pretty good racket at Grassy Lake. The best known haven was the one at Kip, where the Belly and the Old Mans came together. When the News started publishing in 1885, it made a great play for a new halfway house on this side of the river, as they said. Mr. D. Fraser, the proprietor, advertised a fine new building with good corral accommodation. Rufus Payne, not to be outdone, advertised his place as Rufus Payne's Mail and Stage Station. It was a little farther up the river. Their slogan was good accommodation for man and beast. In June of 1886, Fraser's advertisement had disappeared, and Long and Urch had bought out Rufus Payne and are now running the stopping place on this side of the river at Kip. In May of 1887, Long and Urch are enlarging because of increased traffic, says the paper. In August, it was announced that Long and Urch have a new building at Kip and can accommodate 40 or 50 people in the dining room. Now, we've had the gentleman here working for the Alberta government on the question of what do we do with that halfway house? Do we build it here? Do we improve it here and keep it as a museum for our own people? Or do we let it go to, what's that institution in Calgary? Not the Glenbow, the...
Heritage Park?
Yeah, that Heritage Park. Well, what had happened to Fraser's place? Well, here's an article, an item on December the 3rd, 1887. The building at Kip, formerly used as a stopping place, is to become a barracks for the Kip detachment. 7 men and 1 sergeant under Inspector Howe of K Troop will be there. And the last mention I found was in May 1889 when this advertisement appeared. And then Long and Urch stopped advertising for a long time. I don't know whether they quarreled with the editor or whether they went on an economy binge. Kip Hotel, no, not halfway house anymore. Mail and Stage Station, halfway house between Mclaugh and Lethbridge. Good accommodation for the traveling public. None of your man and beast stuff. Ferry and Connection, Long and Urch proprietors. Big deal. But after May 1889, they didn't advertise anymore. Those were the halcyon days. And an article in the Lethbridge Herald a little while ago has revived a lot of interest in this place. And at the time that I'm reading about now, the stage had changed hands. Captain Stewart, who had owned the stage line, had moved to Calgary and sold his stage out to Bentley and Company in Lethbridge. So it was Bentley that ran it in the last few days. Well, all this time there had been very little in the way of road improvement. In July 1886, Mr. W.D. Whitney has been given the contract to improve the Mclaugh Road to Mr. C.A. McGrath's plans. The grant is to improve the road up Telegraph Coulee, spelled this way. Now, which was Telegraph Coulee, I'm not so sure. He had several hang-ups in spelling, and French Coulee and Chinese Coulee were kind of a chop suey as far as he was concerned. It is claimed that it would be better to go up Telegraph Coulee than the one along the Sharon Mine, and he had a little trouble spelling that too. Must have been one of the days when he had a hangover. The editor further suggested that by improving the Coulee at the west end of Redpath Street, that's straight down 3rd Avenue, several miles could be cut off the distance to Mclaugh. In November 1887, the editor suggested that the Northwest Council grant could either be used to make a better road down the 4th Street, 2nd Avenue, Coulee, or it could be held and applied on a bridge. But just where the road did go down is nowhere stated in the newspaper I looked for it, except that one day he said, there was a letter to the editor which complained of rubbish being dumped between the hospital and the Mclaugh Road right up to Smith Street, which was 4th Avenue. They were really, imagine people dumping stuff. Never do that today. Except I have a couple of mattresses that are out in front of the Hague Clinic. I don't know. Well, so I'm not quite sure where the road went. I'll have to collaborate with some of our old-timers here and find out where that road went down. In the meantime, the company completed a road to its property straight down from the end of Baroness Road. That's 1st Avenue. And set the paper, "It is one of the best with very good drainage." On the other hand, the Board of Trade, newly formed in November 1889, initiated work on the 6-mile Coulee and managed to cut off 4 or 5 miles off the road to the St. Mary's ranches. Mr. Ross supervised the work and is now awaiting the money from the grant of the Northwest Council. At least he was trusting anyway. This was probably the money that the editor wanted to improve the hill down 4th Street. Every time I go down, you know, it's hard for me to realize that Lethbridge used to be just that block from Baroness Street to Redpath Street. When I first saw Lethbridge, it was 1921, it seemed to have moved down, and the area between 3rd and 4th on 5th Street seemed to be busier the first time I saw it, and so that the corner of 5th Street and 4th Avenue seemed to be more the center of town than 3rd Avenue and 5th Street. Now, of course, it's moved to 6th Street, and unless Woodward moves it back again, well, it'll be back to 4th and 5th again, I suppose, in the old days. Well, but that's about, they cut off 4 or 5 miles off the road to the St. Mary's ranches. And that was all the road improvement that I could find anywhere. We read today with sadness of the number of traffic accidents and deaths and injuries associated with them. They seem more serious and numerous today, but the weekly reports of traffic accidents are hardly less numerous considering the sparse population. Almost everyone had horses and buggies or Democrats and other conveyances. And scarcely any resident of Lethbridge area escaped without some vehicular mishap. I was struck right at the beginning by the number of runaways. On May the 7th, 1886, Mr. E.T. Saunders was hurt recently in an accident with his horse and buggy. Mr. Brown's water wagon came to grief. The team ran away and knocked over a privy. Sad. One horse broke his leg and had to be shot. Well, it was October the 27th. It was pretty close to Halloween anyway, so it was all right. In the same issue, Polly's stage tipped over on the hill on the other side. Most of the 10 or 11 passengers were outside, and they were shaken up. In July of 1887, a non-accident was reported. Mr. E.T. Galt has bought a new closed carriage. It is the first such vehicle here. And then Mr. W. Henderson, Lethbridge House, West of the Square proprietor, you know, he was hurt when his team ran away down the hill. Mr. Saunders finally gave up reporting all accidents, contenting himself with such statements as, "There seems to be a spate of runaways lately," or "There were 2 runaways this week but no injuries." One accident, however, had to be specified. September the 26th, 1889, Mr. D. Duff's team, loaded with lumber, ran into Mr. Noel's beer wagon going down the Coulee. He didn't specify if Mr. Noel's wagon was loaded or not. But 2 accidents in the province in 1880 received wide publicity. Senator Hardesty was killed in a traffic accident. He fell out of a buggy. And the Reverend John McLean, the Bishop of Saskatchewan, was killed in a street accident. 2 buggies collided in Edmonton. So I can conclude this section by this little statement. August the 27th, 1890. This is getting to be a great town for runaways. It must be the bracing climate. Well, now, a bridge on the River Leth. Shall I do that? And then quit? Okay, if you're game, because I got a lot of stuff. I got something on the Mormons too. I'll have to give you that next day. It won't hurt any Mormon feelings, I'm quite sure, but it's nice for them to see, you know, how others saw them in the old days, and maybe learn a few things that they didn't know. In view of all the difficulties with river crossing them, it would have been surprising if the idea of a bridge across the valley didn't occur to the residents of Lethbridge early. In fact, a note in the news in July 1886 mentioned the fact that Mr. Bailey, the railway superintendent, was drawing up plans for a bridge. but whether this was to be undertaken by the company or not is not clear. Certainly, this was one job that could not be performed by a committee in subscriptions. The next best thing would be to pester the government of the Northwest Territories, and if you failed with them, the government of Canada to put in a bridge. Consequently, in October, 2 petitions were circulated for presentation to the government. One was for daily mail service, and one was for a bridge. As with most petitions, the result was nil. In 1887, when all the river crossings were impassable, an editorial appeared advocating bridges at both Kipp and Lethbridge, and the editor stressed the growth and importance of the area and the frequency of interruptions in trade and travel. In May, an item of $10,000 in the parliamentary estimates for a bridge across the Old Man's River at Mclaugh stirred Lethbridge into action. After all, Lethbridge needed the bridge worse than Mclaugh did. If them, why not us, you know, that sort of thing. Well, D.W. Davis is our MP too, so they called a meeting for 2 o'clock, and they sent a mass telegram to D.W. Davis down there. It was estimated that the bridge would cost between $15,000 and $20,000, and a larger sum was specified in the telegram. Each time something happened, such as the loss of D Troop horses, the editor would harp on the same string, and by the end of June 1887, a letter from Mr. Davis stated that the Honorable Thomas White, Minister of Public Works, would put a sum for a bridge into the supplementary estimates. And in early November 1887, and it's rather interesting, the editor had a little trouble with this name. The name was he spelled it with the I in front of the U, so you could look more like Gauvin or something. But Monsieur Gouin, you know, it's a very French name. They are French people in the government in Ottawa, you know. And the number of them were ministers. Well, it looked as if they were going to get a bridge anyway, because in early November 1887, Mr. Gouin came to town to locate a site for a bridge, and he picked a spot at the lower side of the point below the pump house. See, everybody knew where all these buildings were. We don't. We just have to guess. Well, maybe some of you do. The bridge was to be 615 feet long with 200-foot approaches. The ascent would be via a coulee a little below the one followed by the telegraph poles. And the editor was still a little fearful, as nothing as yet appeared in the supplementary estimates. He suggested at this time that the Northwest Council grant be used to improve the 4th Street road down the coulees or even make a better bridge. But nothing happened. And the News in frustration in March 1888 writes a big editorial on the need for a bridge, and he used all the other arguments he'd ever used before, including one new one. He said, as the company owns most of the land on this side of the river, a bridge is needed for settlers to get to free homestead land on the other side of the river. In other words, the West Side story started in March 1888. On March the 29th, the meeting was called to press for a bridge, but they had difficulty finding a hall big enough, so the editor decided that maybe they should work for a hall at the same time. Might as well kill 2 stones with 1 bird or something. Well, they again petitioned Parliament for a bridge, but in May, they found no mention of a bridge for Lethbridge or Kipp in the supplementary estimates. You could almost hear them saying, "Oh Lord, how long, oh Lord." But nothing happened. May the 29th, a meeting was called to press for a bridge. And then he brightened them up a week later by saying, "We understand on good authority that an addition will be made to the supplementary estimates for a bridge." Hooray, said everybody. And behold, 15,000 was added to the estimates in June the 7th, 1888. But Mr. Saunders suggested that no cheers be raised, as the same thing had previously been done for other places like Mclaugh, and no work had been started there yet either, and that was as long as 2 years. From McLeod's experience, he knew that a sum in the estimates doesn't build any bridges. So, says the editor, let's get agitating again. Then we can have a settlement west of the river. And in September he burst out again. Looks like nothing's going to be done this year. McLeod has had a grant now for 2 years, but still no bridge. In November, the citizens tried another tack. They sent a generously signed petition to the Northwest Territories Council. On January 1889, the hopes of Lethbridge were raised again when advices from Ottawa, back with the Northwest Council of Ottawa will do it, indicated that bridges would be built at Mclaugh, at Kipp, and at Lethbridge at the earliest possible moment. Or something like the changing of the name of the river from 1886 to 1915, you know, it's the earliest possible moment. How long is that? Well, by gar, Monsieur Gouin, the chief engineer for Manitoba and the Northwest Territories, arrived at Lethbridge again before the end of the month and started taking levels. Now that's really something. When you start taking levels, you're really doing something. The bridge is to be of wood with stone filling in abutments and piers. And that was that until May, when the news complained about the council building a home for the lieutenant governor in Regina when there were no bridges on the belly or the old man. Doggone it. Priorities, you know. Why didn't let the old lieutenant governor stay out in the tent or something? And then, with great fanfare, on July the 3rd, 1889, the Government of Canada, dateline Ottawa, June the 14th, 1889, calls for tenders for a bridge on the Belly River. And from then on, it was all mining, as we coal miners say. It was just easy. The plans were released. The bridge would have 4 spans and 3 abutments. The piers would be 43 by 15 feet at the base and 10 feet 6 inches at the upstream end, and would be filled with stone ballast. English or Canadian iron was specified. The editor then got after the local MLA, Mr. Haltane, to get a grant to improve the hill while they were building the bridge. Maybe the Northwest Council would do that anyway. I was never able to discover that any improvement was made from that source at all prior to incorporation. And I've got to start reading on again, but I think I better clear up this mess first. Well, August the 14th, the edition announced the contract had been given to Mr. Dan Whitty for $24,800 for this bridge. The disgruntled local bidders claimed that the bridge couldn't be built for that sum. And then, strangely enough, that apparently was Mr. Whitty's conclusion, because a week later, Ottawa announced the awarding of a contract to Gay and Mclaugh of Lethbridge for $38,000. From this time, the news recorded the advances and retreats as the construction proceeded. Tenders for stone were called. Mr. J. Bright, a ranchman from Willow Creek, was appointed government engineer. September the 25th, Engineer Gouin and Superintendent Bright went with Gay and Mclaugh, these are the contractors, to mark the spots for the piers. The timber is on sites and the excavations commenced by October the 30th. A pile driver with the necessary timber was ready, said the editor, by November the 20th. Don't you feel the excitement rising? Well, December the 4th, work on the bridge has stopped because no timber has arrived yet. January the 22nd, when the timber arrived, the contractor said they would push the work to make up for lost time. The foundations were in by February the 12th, 1890, but no piles had arrived, so they couldn't drive the piles. My girl has poles here. We had Slovaks, but no poles at that time. They hoped to do this before high water. It was not ho-hum, though, because I like this. Many visitors went down to view the bridge on Sunday afternoon. Have you been down to view the bridge? Well, and 15 tons of iron arrived for the upper part. And by the end of February, most of the material had arrived, and piles were driven around 2 piers, and the work on the 3rd was proceeding. And then the editor began to get expansive, and he envisioned large settlements around Hooflup and St. Mary's and Lee's Creek. There would be over 3,000 people when the bridge was finished. The west side would open up, and the railway would continue west through the Crow's Nest Pass, and even the Calgary-Edmonton line, just starting, would now extend directly to Lethbridge. By March, the piles were all in. It will be finished by June the 1st, and teams will even cross it by mid-May, said the news. In April, the news was that the superstructure was proceeding. But on the 21st of May issue, the bridge was still not completed. Because of high water from recent rains, one span will have to wait for lower water. As a matter of fact, this issue was so faint it was very hard for me to read it, almost as if Mr. Saunders had wept all over it and washed off the print. He gave the bridge half a column on July the 2nd by saying the delay was due to late delivery and wrong dimensions. Sort of a dimension of precox or something, because he spelled that wrong too. But he concluded that the work on the 2 completed spans was substantial and thorough. He keeps backing up all this. He's only got 2 spans finished now. It was all but the last one before. The state of mind of the editor may be judged from this item on August the 6th. Construction is still going on the bridge. One man in an accident lost 3 fingers, while another killed a rattlesnake 4 feet long. Bridge is really going ahead. Well, this was the time when the mud was so bad that all traffic was suspended. The ford is dangerous and the river is up. But if the editor was discouraged, a local bard, W.A.D., it must be Mr. Darch, wrote a poem of 8 verses Now, this is what I was going to ask my pal over there to do for me. I'll have to do it myself. I only copied down verses 2 and 3, but I want you to read, the high-class epic poetry of Lethbridge. In the district of Alberta, in Canada's northwest, near the growing town of Lethbridge, a river rushes past. From time to time, a life is lost while fording with a team, for the water's deep and icy cold in this swift-flowing stream. After due consideration, the Premier did decide to build a bridge from shore to shore where the river was not wide. The plans were drawn, the contract let. How much I cannot say. The lowest tender got the job, Mclaugh and Gay. But I thought you'd appreciate the quality. It sounds a little like a fellow who wrote after 1896, doesn't it? Well, and so autumn ad octem versem or something, 8 verses of it. I wish I'd copied it because it's real quality poetry, he knows not how much it cost, he says. Well, it was $38,000. If he'd read his newspaper, he'd have known. Well, to top it off, on September the 24th, Charles Diamond at the bridge tried to cross, but the unfinished approaches had loose boards, causing the horses to back down, throwing Mr. Diamond and his wagon. November the 12th sees this doleful announcement. The bridge is now being used, but the approaches are not finished. They should be finished next week. Now, perhaps this item will end this doleful tale. At the end of November in 1890, the recently formed Board of Trade called a meeting to press for a new courthouse for Lethbridge. And this was well reported in the news. And during the discussion, Mr. C.A. Mclaugh said, "It's time the government did something for us. They have given us nothing but a bridge, and even that is of little use." And then he kind of scared his little self and decided, well, it's a good bridge, mind you, if they really get to work on it. He backed up a bit. So he hoped it would be properly completed. So why did the bridge, so long expected, not cause a great celebration? Partly it was the delay, but much more important developments had occurred. The railway to Great Falls was completed, causing a real estate boom with a great increase in construction. Incorporation of the town had almost been completed, and few people had time to be concerned about anything as picayune as a bridge. Perhaps later there was an official opening with magnificent oratory, but I haven't come upon it yet. But anyway, that's how they built the bridge on the River Leth. So I'll leave that there now and let you keep it relaxed again. But as you see, I have lots more.